So I am going to spend the next sort of 4 Tuesday evenings arguing to you that it is impossible to overestimate the influence of the Crusades, not only on medieval history, but also on modern history. So you can see these are probably some of the images that you think about when you think about the Crusades. So there's all of the 12th century stuff on the left. There's this beautiful little statue of a wife greeting her returning Crusader husband. There's all the ideas of, the Crusaders sort of marching off, led by Christ or somebody else, to Jerusalem. Some people, if I talk about the Crusades, will also think about things like the Battle of Lepanto, all the way in 1571, and that is in the lower left, from the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. Some people might even go as late as the Polish relief of Vienna. There it is in the 1680s, in the upper right. All of these things have been called crusades. They were called crusades by the people who undertook them at the time. But if Dan takes us to the next slide, the crusades have a very, very long and interesting afterlife. So we can think about things like the Jarrow Crusade, for example. It has nothing to do with retaking the Holy Sepulchre, but the idea is that it is a sort of noble undertaking in the 1930s in defense of the sort of poor and out of work. Above that is the crusade against communism from Romania, talking about, getting the Soviets out of Romania during the war. After the war, after World War II, we have things like the crusade for victory over communism. We have, even most recently, what George W. Bush sort of accidentally on purpose called a crusade against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We have all kinds of cultural artifacts and productions. There's a beautiful sort of still image of a returning crusader playing chess with death from the Seventh Seal. So the Crusades have been with us since 1095. They will continue, I would argue, to be with us. And if there is a more powerful cultural touchstone, not only for Western European culture, but also, and probably especially, for culture in the Middle East. So we'll talk about Nasser in the 1960s in the last sort of episode of this program, as it were. So the Crusades were literally a worldwide phenomenon, and they've lasted for over a millennium. They're not going away. But the problem is, if Dan takes us to the next slide, there is no more probably important cultural touchstone, but there is also no more misunderstood, whether deliberately or not, cultural touchstone. The problem is that most of what people think they know about the Crusades is just simply wrong. This has been the case since, you can see there, the history of the Holy War, which was written by a chaplain to Charles I, a fellow called Fuller, who called the Crusades, and I quote, a quicksand to swallow treasure. So ever since the 1630s, the Crusades have been seen as a sort of, excess of popery gone wrong, or they've been seen as, they've become part of the culture war. The idea that, we are going to, push people who believe sort of differently than we do out of the West and out of Western culture, and, recapture somehow some more clean, now whether that's racially or religiously clean vision of Europe. Well, people like Anders Breivik, who sort of shoot up summer camps full of children, could probably tell you. On the other side, there's also the sort of utopian vision that you get with films like Kingdom of Heaven, where, the Crusades are, well, the other side is sort of all about enlightenment and, in the kind of post-invasion of Iraq era, can't we all just get along? All of these sort of cultural artifacts have fundamentally misunderstood, again, whether deliberately or not, the actual idea, the purpose, and even the history of the Crusades. So this sort of series is not fundamentally a revisionist idea of the Crusades. It is a simply trying to be historically factual overview of the Crusades, so that when inevitably people online or in real life bring up the Crusades as an example of barbarity, backwardness, an example of, why the Christian religion obviously can't be true, there's something to say to these people. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide. Now, here is a few questions that I have for you, and I am hoping that by the end of these 4 sessions, you'll be able to answer them all. Now, right now, probably you have an idea of when the Crusades actually took place. Most people think that they are a 12th century phenomenon. Certainly they started in 1095 with the call of Pope Urban II, and they ended in 1291 with the fall of the last Crusader state in the Middle East, right? As you will have already seen from some of the images that I showed you of the Polish relief in Vienna from the 1680s, I don't think that the Crusades ended in 1291. Well, where were the Crusades then? It's all about Jerusalem, isn't it? Well, that's not quite right either. So we'll answer these 4 questions together as we go along. Right, so next slide. So tonight we are talking about the First Crusade and the idea of crusading. And I've named that after probably the most famous book on crusading, which I do suggest that you get, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Next week, we'll talk about what are commonly known as the Crusader states and crusading up to about 1291. So when the last Crusader state in what is now sort of Israel, Palestine, falls to the armies of the Egyptians. Session 3, we'll talk about the Crusades that most people don't know about. So Crusades against Christians. Yes, Crusades against Christians, and also the Crusades in what was then called heatheness. So the idea of like the Baltic, Poland, Lithuania, against tribes or people who were still worshipping pagan idols up until just about the 14th century, the mid-14th century. We'll talk about crusading as, frankly, one of the first organized package holiday tours. Some of the kings of England went on a crusade as a packaged holiday tour, Henry IV probably being the most famous of these. And in session 4, we'll talk about the 15th century and beyond. This is where we get into sort of my research, especially on English crusading and engagement with the later Crusades. But we'll also talk about, as I say, the leftover, the afterlife, and especially the re-rise of the Crusades as a especially important topic in relations between Europe and the Middle East, and especially the use of the Crusades in, say, pan-Arab nationalism in the 1960s. I have watched the interminable crusading movie Al Nasser Salah ad-Din, which was made under Nasser's government in Egypt in the 1960s, so you don't have to. It's an absolutely awful movie, but fascinating for a number of reasons. So this, I hope, is sort of maybe, if not what you were expecting, something that will be interesting to you as time goes on. All right, so next slide, let's talk about why I have called this session the First Crusade and the idea of crusading. So this is was, I should say, a groundbreaking book written by a professor who started up the program that I did my master's in Crusade studies about, formerly of Royal Holloway, and then eventually a professor at Cambridge. So Jonathan Riley Smith did something that many Crusades historians over the past sort of 4 centuries leading up to the publication of this book had never done. They had never asked why, and they had never really thought about what the ideas, what the actual sort of motivations, what the personal experience of the Crusaders were. Histories of the Crusades up until the publication of this book had mostly focused on, I suppose, what I'll call the second sons hypothesis, the idea that there were sort of dispossessed nobles, maybe they were the second son, they weren't going to get any lands, they weren't going to get any inheritance from their fathers, so they were sort of packed off to Jerusalem to win a fortune for the family and to get some land for themselves. Obviously, that is a hypothesis that has not gone away. I mean, that is the basic premise of the movie The Kingdom of Heaven, for example. It has very, very little to do with history. Riley Smith's innovation was that he talked about the motivations and the goals of the Crusaders, as well as about the sort of usual historical fodder, like the organization, like the financing, like the leadership of the First Crusade. So we are going to sort of follow, not entirely follow Riley Smith this evening, but we're going to think a little bit about the goals and motivations and the self-understanding of the Crusaders in the context of the First Crusade. So we'll follow them to Jerusalem tonight, and then next week we will pick up where the story leaves off and talk about the sort of civilization that they built, a very interesting civilization that they built in Jerusalem and the surrounding counties. All right, so that's sort of housekeeping and framing having been done. Let's sort of dig in. Okay. So, the story of the First Crusade does not begin in 1095. It begins about sort of 25 years before that. The Byzantine Empire, by which I mean the sort of successor state to Rome, it's important to realize the Byzantines would not have called themselves the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves the Roman Empire, but, you know, that's neither here nor there. So this is a successor state to Rome. It's focused on the city of Constantinople. It did, you know, it had a big hinterland in Anatolia, what's now sort of modern day Turkey, but was also in what we would now know as Bulgaria, Macedonia, basically the whole type of place around the Black Sea. So the problem was, for Byzantium, that it had a vast territory to defend, but not the population to defend it. So Byzantium had for literally hundreds of years been employing mercenaries from Western Europe. Amusingly, it used to employ a lot of Vikings, which is why you get silk and things from Constantinople in hordes from Iceland and things like that. And quite a lot of the Icelandic sagas complain that all of the Vikings who went out to Constantinople came back with refined tastes and were effete and were no longer sort of proper Vikings anymore. Obviously, you go out to Constantinople, you turn into a Greek. It was a problem for the Vikings. But anyway, so the Byzantine Empire had been employing mercenaries from Western Europe for literally hundreds of years. Pope Urban II called a council, not first at Clermont, but at Piacenza in Italy. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent representatives to the Council of Piacenza to say, look, my immediate predecessors have lost a huge number of battles against these people called the Seljuk Turks. In 1071, there was this horrible battle called Manzikert, and the emperor was captured, and basically the entire Byzantine army was killed. So can you send us a couple of chaps to help us recover some of the lost territories? Now, just what Alexios asked for has been a matter for extreme debate ever since, frankly. Now, whether he asked for a handful of mercenaries, whether he asked for a couple hundred knights just to bulk out the army, or whether, as Peter Frankopan said, he asked for an entire crusade, people will argue back and forth. You can see my doctoral supervisor, Jonathan Harris, wrote probably the seminal book on Byzantium and the Crusades. I also recommend it, not just because he's my doctoral supervisor, but because he meticulously looks through the sources, both Western and Byzantine, and sort of puts paid to this idea of Peter Frankopan's that, oh yes, Alexios really wanted 75,000 randoms from Western Europe to come and sort of camp out in his territory. It was not a thing. But in any case, Alexios asked for some help of some kind. But what he got is maybe not what he expected. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as you can see, the Byzantine territory, if you look in 1071, you know, all of sort of Greece and Bulgaria and Turkey is looking, you know, purple and Byzantine. It's great. Within about sort of 20 years, the empire essentially collapsed. You can see that it no longer has Anatolia anymore. So this was the problem that Alexios was dealing with, that he asked for some help, some kind of help, to push back. Okay, next slide. Right. So this is where most people sort of pick up the story of the Crusades. We're in Clermont, in France. Pope Urban II is addressing a big council of the church. So not only are a bunch of ecclesiastics assembled, you also have the leading noblemen, not only of sort of, well, I should say what we call France now has nothing to do with what France was in 1095. France was essentially a sort of 5-mile loop around Paris. The most important people in what's now France were in the south, and we'll talk about those chaps in a moment. But basically, the high nobility of Western Europe was also assembled at Clermont to meet the Pope. Urban II preached a sermon, and there are 5 different accounts of what he said. It is not possible to unify all of them. So you have to pick, as a historian, the one that you think is probably the most reliable. A fellow called Fulker of Chartres was actually there. He wrote, within a couple of years of Urban's speech at Clermont, a chronicle giving what he said was essentially a word-for-word account of Urban's speech. Whether it was or was not an actual word-by-word account, it's probably the most reliable. And what Fulker says that Urban said at Clermont was, he preached not necessarily a holy war, but certainly an armed struggle, an armed conflict for the rescue of fellow Christians who were in danger in the East. The idea was that a number of soldiers from Western Europe would go to the Middle East to defend their fellow Christians from persecution. Fulker also said that the way that Urban framed this was to say, look, you've been fighting against your fellow Christians here in Europe Why don't you do something useful for once with your swords and go out and defend your brethren from persecution? And if you do this, this will meet St. Augustine's requirements for a just war, because it will be a defensive war, because you're going out to help your fellow Christians. You will be fighting for Christ and his church, and your sins in doing the war will be forgiven if you should happen to die in the service of protecting your brethren in the East. Now, this is the most sort of sensible account of what Urban said. Now, some other sources that were writing within about sort of 10 to 15 years say things like, and immediately all of the assembled knights broke out into the cries of Deus Vult, God wills it, God wills it. This is reading later things back into history. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Okay, but first we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so after Clermont, the proper knights, like the actual experienced soldiers under sensible military leaders, took a while to put an expedition together because they wanted to do sensible things like arranging transport and food and arms for the people that they would be taking on what was, incidentally, not yet called a crusade. The term crusade didn't exist. It wouldn't be in use until the 13th century. And in fact, the word crusade was never really used at all. It was usually called the negotium crucis, so the business of the cross, rather than crusade. But that's sort of by the by. As I say, so the experienced soldiers took a while to put an expedition together, as you would imagine, wanting to sort of do the logistics properly. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there was a sort of, he was a friar, but not really. He was a hermit, essentially, called, unsurprisingly, Peter the Hermit. He was a French guy. He went around what's now France, whipping up a number of sort of peasants and saying, look, chaps, the Pope has said we're all going to go to the Holy Sepulchre and take it back from the evil people who have colonized it. So you definitely want to go on pilgrimage with me. Don't worry about food. Don't worry about arms, because God will protect us. We have the armor of God. So, like, never mind about sort of legitimate, useful things like food. Let's just all go walk to the Holy Land now. They did walk to the Holy Land, unfortunately via Germany. And when you have whipped up a large number of peasants who don't understand anything and are sort of filled with a holy fire, so-called, in their bellies, they tend to take it out on innocent people nearer at hand. And unfortunately, the innocent people nearer at hand that they took it out on were the Jews of Germany. And this is sort of not the first, nor unfortunately was it the last slaughter of the Jews of Germany that happened in the name of Christ. So, having slaughtered many of the Jews of Germany, the Peasants Crusade marched overland, so walking all the way down through the Balkans, through Hungary, people giving them passage and giving them food, not so much because they believed in what the peasants of the Peasants Crusade were doing, but mostly because they just wanted to get them out of their territory, because a large peasant rabble was rather dangerous, as unfortunately the Jews had found to their cost. So these peasants, and some sources say there were up to 100,000 of them. I think it's probably much less than that, but much less being probably about 35 to 50,000, which is still a lot of peasants, mind you. They arrived outside of Constantinople. So Emperor Alexios's capital. Emperor Alexios speaks with Peter the Hermit. He says, look, now the Turks are very dangerous. And if I send your unarmed peasants just randomly into Anatolia, you are going to be killed. So shouldn't you wait for the proper soldiers to come behind you who will protect you and sort of keep you from the Turks? Peter the Hermit refused to hear Emperor Alexios's sound advice. And Emperor Alexios, not wanting these sort of between 35 and 100,000 random Western European peasants camped outside his capital anymore, decided that the path of least resistance was to ferry them across the Bosphorus and let them march into Turkey if that's really what they wanted to do. And so they did. And they were slaughtered rather horribly by the Seljuks, as Emperor Alexios had foreseen. One of the survivors, however, of the slaughter was, no prizes for guessing, Peter himself, having apparently, once he reached Anatolia, realized that this was a bad idea. He decided to go back to Constantinople to sort of quote unquote gather supplies. So he escaped from the slaughter and left the peasants for whom he had made himself responsible by calling them up to be slaughtered, as I say. Right, so we'll leave Peter there for a moment, hanging out in Constantinople. We'll go on to the next slide, because the proper Crusaders, the actual knights who knew what they were doing, were following behind. And if Peter had waited a month, he wouldn't have got his people slaughtered. So there were three major contingents. So the first was Count Raymond of Toulouse, also often called Raymond of Saint-Gilles. Raymond was essentially the most powerful and the richest person in Western Christendom at that point. This was the grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine, should say great-grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he was fabulously rich, fabulously wealthy, fabulously well-connected. And he brought with him his bishop Adhemar as sort of fighting bishop. He was a bishop in arms, and they led the contingent together. The next major contingent was led by Gauthier Bouillon, who became the first, well, you can't really sort of call him king because he refused to be king of Jerusalem, saying that Jesus was the king of Jerusalem, not him. But Godfrey would become essentially the first king of Jerusalem, and he brought his brother Baldwin with him. They brought a large contingent from what's now sort of Belgium, essentially. The next major contingent was Bohemond of Taranto. So he was a Norman, but these were the Normans that had control of southern Italy. So they were essentially Vikings, but they'd sailed all the way to southern Italy and they had the kingdom of Naples. So Bohemond of Taranto, and he brought his nephew Tancred, about whom more later, with him. Okay, there were also some minor contingents, including contingents with an English connection. So Robert Curthose was the son of William the Conqueror. He brought with him his brother-in-law, who was married to Adela, who was William the Conqueror's daughter. They brought with them their friend Hugh of Vermandois, and Robert II of Flanders also brought, a contingent of his own. So there were a lot of cooks in this kitchen, and Raymond, Godfrey, and Bohemond would never get along. Tancred would antagonize everyone, bless him. But overall, there were somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 knights and 35,000 to 50,000 foot soldiers. So this was essentially, the chivalry of Western Europe came out literally in their tens of thousands to go rescue the benighted brethren in the East. They brought with them, as armies usually do, non-combatants, so women, clergy, other people that you would need in order to make a military camp run. So somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people walked or sailed all the way from Western Europe to Constantinople and were camped outside of Alexios's front door. Right, next slide. Now, okay, so here, these are what we know of the origins of the first Crusaders. So you can see sort of Tancred and Bohemond of Taranto's little contingent. They're from southern Italy. There were a lot of folks from what we now know of as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, even some folks from northern Spain, and of course, people from England who came with William the Conqueror's son. All of these went mostly, people in the early Middle Ages were essentially sort of terrified of going by sea. So they walked, most of them, all the way to Constantinople from France. Okay, next slide. Right. So, as I say, the armies traveled to Constantinople by various routes. So Godfrey, the Northern Europe contingent, walked through the Balkans. Raymond of Toulouse led the Provençal southern French contingent down the Adriatic coast and then walked overland to Constantinople. Of course, the Normans, descendants of Vikings, they had no problem going by sea, so they just sort of popped over the Adriatic by boat. So suddenly, the Emperor of Byzantium had a problem, which is a very large number of people who spoke no Greek, camped out on his doorstep. Right, next slide. Now, there are a number of sources that talk about what happened next. Probably the most interesting, certainly the most important, was written by Alexios's daughter, Anna, who was an enormously well-educated woman and was sort of deep in her father's counsels, as it were. The problem with Anna's source is that she wrote it about sort of 20 years after the events happened. And of course, she writes it in order to justify everything that her father had done. So there is, Anna has a point of view. Similarly, somebody in Tancred's army wrote essentially, a hagiography about how wonderful Tancred was. That's, one of the sources that we have. So we have a number of contemporary sources, but they each have their own sort of points of view and own problems. Now, where they all agree is that Alexios had a big problem because one of the Crusader commanders, as I've said, was Bohemond. He brought his loose cannon nephew Tancred with him. Well, the Normans of southern Italy had been invading Byzantine territory for years. So of course Alexios didn't trust them. He had never met the rest of the contingent. Suddenly, he has 100,000 people camped out on his doorstep, all of whom need food, all of whom need some kind of lodging. And so what does he do? Well, he falls back on the ancient Byzantine custom of, as Anna says, putting gold in the barbarians' mouths in order to sort of move them on. He says, look, I will give you food, I will give you sort of military support, I'll give you everything you need if you will swear an oath saying that whatever you recapture belongs to me. And eventually, after a tense period of, is Bohemond actually going to try to invade the city rather than just agree to this oath? everybody, crucially, except Raymond of Toulouse, swears the oath to the emperor saying, whatever we recapture, we're going to give it back to you. Okay, and this is what historians have used to say, look, for at least some of these people, certainly at least for Bohemond, obviously this is a war about territory, because why should they be, unwilling to swear an oath to the emperor saying we're going to return your land to you if what they've done is go over there to try to defend their eastern brethren from the depredations of the Turks. So historians have not been unreasonable when they've said that, but it's a matter for interpretation. Okay, so next slide, we're going to talk about some battles. I'm going to try to keep this fairly short because talking about battle after battle after battle, they all sort of, people's eyes glaze over. So we'll talk about 3 of the most important ones. So Nicaea. This is essentially the second center of the empire. It had been obviously very important to Christianity from the outset. There's a number of councils that happen in Nicaea, and Alexios says, okay, Crusaders, the first thing that you're going to do for me is go to recapture Nicaea. Godfrey of Bouillon's the first to arrive. Now, usually in the Middle Ages, you want to avoid a pitched battle. So all of these movies that show sort of 2 armies staring at each other across a field, that is completely anachronistic, almost completely anachronistic. What mostly happened in the Middle Ages was siege warfare, which is you draw your huge army up outside a city and you try to stop supplies from getting into it, and you essentially wait until the people inside the city are starving or die of disease and give up the city to you. So that's what they're trying to do. Now, Alexios secretly had sent to the Turks that were occupying Nicaea saying, look, mate, I'll do you a deal. If you give the city up to my chap, to Butamides, I will let your families go, we'll do a deal. So he essentially, as the Crusaders later say, sort of double crosses them, as it were. The Crusaders lay siege to the city. What does happen is that the city, the Turkish occupiers of the city, surrender to the Byzantine general, and the Crusaders are livid because they've walked all the way from Western Europe to do this, and the Byzantines are just arranging with the Turks. They're not even letting them have a sort of proper fight. Now, Alexios tries to smooth this over with a liberal application of gold. But this is where Crusader-Byzantine relations really start to break down. But at the very least, Nicaea is now back in the empire after June 1097. Right, this is where things start going south for the Crusaders. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the siege of Nicaea had only taken a couple of months. If you look at the length of the siege of Antioch, it takes the best part of a year, sort of 9 months. Why? What happens? Well, the Crusaders don't have Byzantine support. Antioch is absolutely huge. It is, again, one of the major cities of the empire. The Crusader army begins a siege on the 20th of October. The Crusader army, even at somewhere between sort of 30 and 50,000 combatants at this time, is still not big enough to actually surround the city. And Antioch is on a lake. So what happens is that the Turks keep sending in supplies by ship. So the whole Crusader tactic of trying to starve people out doesn't actually work. The Crusaders themselves begin starving by December. The Turks have burnt everything around the city. There's nothing for the Crusaders to eat. The Byzantines have gone away because, again, they have the Crusaders have antagonized Alexios, and things are looking very, very bad. By January, Bishop Adhemar, so Raymond's sort of bishop, chaplain, orders processions and fasting. Going around the walls of Antioch. They expel all of the women from the camp because women means vice and vice means the judgment of God. And so obviously you have to expel the women from the camp. Many Crusaders deserted, including Stephen of Blois, who was again married to William the Conqueror's daughter Adela. Now, it's amusing about Stephen. As soon as he gets back to Adela in France, she says, Stephen, what you doing here? You turn around and you go right back to that crusade, young man. And he does, and he gets himself killed in the Second Crusade, but never mind. Anyway, so then the worst thing happens. So the Crusaders have been sacked in front of Antioch from October to May. A Turkish army out of Afghanistan starts marching towards Antioch. Things are looking horrible. So the Crusaders, they sort of think that we are going to have to take the city before this army from Afghanistan arrives. And then something miraculous happens. Let's go to the next slide. Right. It is at this time that the Provençal peasant has a dream. He has a dream that if they dig under the floor in the Cathedral of Antioch, they will find the Holy Lance, the lance that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. And if they can just dig up this holy relic and carry it before the armies, all of their problems will be solved. So, in fact, the Crusaders do dig under the floor of the cathedral in Antioch, and miraculously, they pull out a lump of rusty metal. This holy relic, it briefly sort of makes people sort of rather happy. My God, we found the Holy Lance, we're saved. But the problem is all of the Provençals, so all of the contingent of Raymond of Toulouse believed it. Bishop Adhemar believed it because, of course, it's a Provençal peasant, right? Peter Bartholomew, who has pulled this out of the sort of floor, as it were. All of the people from Northern Europe, and especially those Normans from the south of Italy, don't believe it for a minute. But nevertheless, they do defeat that army that had been coming from Afghanistan, and Antioch is saved. Now, Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who found this quote-unquote Holy Lance, would later agree to an ordeal, to a trial by fire. Bishop Adhemar, so his main supporter, died. Peter Bartholomew maintained that it really was the Holy Lance, thank you. And he said, look, if you don't believe it, I'll agree to a trial by fire. So, light a fire, and I will walk into the middle of the fire holding the Holy Lance. And obviously, since it's such a powerful relic, I won't die from walking into the middle of a fire because I'm holding this relic. No prizes for guessing that Peter Bartholomew dies rather horribly, still clutching the lump of what he said was the sacred lance that had pierced Christ's side. But in any case, holy or not, real lance or not, it does, at least the temporary morale boost, helps the Crusaders to win Antioch. There's a bunch of side quests that happen at this time out to the county of Edessa, which we'll talk about next time. It's not important now, but I have one more battle, the most important battle, to talk to you about before we leave the Crusaders in Jerusalem. So here's the siege of Jerusalem. Now, After the siege of Nicaea, Stephen of Blois had written to his wife Adela saying, "Oh yes, we'll be in Jerusalem in 5 weeks." 2 years after Stephen wrote that letter to Adela, the Crusaders pull up outside of Jerusalem. Quite a lot of people, they cry, they weep tears of joy at seeing Jerusalem. They'd spent somewhere between, depending where they were coming from, between 3 and almost 5 years waiting for the day that they would see Jerusalem. After a sort of fairly short siege, actually, from between 7th of June to the 15th of July, the defenders of Jerusalem essentially strike a deal with the Crusaders saying, look, we'll open the gate as long as you let us go without killing us. Unfortunately, the Crusaders agreed to that, but they didn't keep that bargain. So if you read the sources, they will say something like, we slaughtered all of the defenders, the Turkish defenders of Jerusalem, and there was so much blood that it reached up to the stomachs of our horses. They don't mean this literally. They're using a sort of biblical trope. But essentially, the Crusaders did not keep the bargain, and they slaughtered all of the people that they had sort of agreed to give safe passage to the sea. Now, Urban II died about 2 weeks after Jerusalem was taken, and unfortunately, the news did not reach him in time before he died. So Urban died not knowing that Jerusalem had been retaken. The 22nd of July, so Mary Magdalene's Day, the Crusaders, such as had reached Jerusalem, not all of them did, we'll talk about that a bit next time, a council was decided to see what to do, essentially. Most of the other Crusader leaders had already got a city that they wanted. So, Raymond had won himself Tripoli by then. Bohemond of Taranto had gone out to Edessa. He was happy with the city that he was controlling. So the crown, or rather I should say the not crown, fell to Godfrey of Bouillon. He refused to be called king. What he actually was called was defender of the Holy Sepulchre, because again, Jesus is king of Jerusalem, not Godfrey. And so most of the Crusaders, having won back Jerusalem for Christ, having won back quite a lot of territory actually for the Byzantine Empire as well, felt their oaths fulfilled, and they sailed back or walked back to their homes in Western Europe. Now, Godfrey was left with a very tiny force, a handful of knights, to defend what it was now an absolutely enormous kingdom. This will become a problem for him. It will become a problem for his successors. We'll talk about that a little bit next time. But something to sort of leave you with is the idea of what was the motivations of these people. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but you have some of the richest, best connected, wealthiest people who leave essentially everything to walk halfway across the known world to do something, not quite sure what, in the Middle East. Most of them, including especially Raymond, had given up quite a lot of land in Western Europe or mortgaged it in order to get the money to go on crusade. So when we think about, yes, all of these people were talking about, well, they're capturing this city and that city, and they're taking it and they're holding it, and they capture the Turkish treasury, so suddenly they have a lot of money. Okay, fine. That's all historical. But what actually was the motivation? And I leave you with that as a question that is probably difficult, if not impossible, to fully answer. But at least now we've talked about basically the only crusade that ever worked. The only crusade that ever works is the first one. So we're going to leave Godfrey and his tiny band of men in the new kingdom of Jerusalem for now, sort of suspend that and come back next week. But for now, questions, comments?
Thank you very much.
That was really astonishing. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I should have said at the beginning that I sort of don't encourage people to put questions in the chat, but do go ahead now and ask a question, Evelyn.
Yeah, it was it's fascinating, and thank you so much. That's such an opening. And I was also interested in then how that would that impact on the writing of the period. I mean, you'd mentioned about the Vikings coming back, and I would imagine that really shaped the poetry and the whole nation actually.
Yeah.
So is that an aspect of it over that period?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And we'll talk about that next time. There is an explosion of poetry. There's a sort of idea of amour de loin, so sort of love at a distance. There are troubadours in Western Europe who are writing these beautiful love songs to the Queen of Jerusalem, who they've never seen. Joffrey writes a love song to a woman who he's absolutely never seen. There's a lot of cultural interchange, and we'll talk about all of that next time. And I'll send you some examples of things that you can sort of listen to if you like.
Yeah, great. I'd really appreciate that. Thanks.
Christopher's got his hand raised. Christopher, do you want to?
Yes, I've just unmuted myself. I failed before.
Okay.
Well, the first thing I'd like to ask is how important was it, the idea of Christendom, that there was a Christian world and there was a Muslim world, and we're the goodies, we're going to fight the baddies. And secondly, I was reminded of the fact that when I was myself at a junior school, and I learned about the Crusades, you really get the idea from the literature, and also from Robin Hood, particularly if you think of the 1991 film. Richard the Lionheart appears at the end, the epitome of the righteous ruler who's earned the right to give away his daughter. Yeah. And so I wondered to what last week's gone. But anyway, how important is the idea of Christendom to their motivation and their worldview to explain how they acted as they did?
I mean, you have come onto essentially the mainspring of all of my work and research. So well done there. It is, I think, the driving factor, not only in 1095, but I mean, all the way, frankly, into the 1680s and beyond. The idea that there is a Christendom, there is a sort of sphere of belief that unites people across languages, across nations, across allegiances to various rulers or monarchs. And so there's the idea of fundamentally the people over there, literally thousands of miles away from us, if they are being oppressed, persecuted, if someone is starting a war against them, we have an investment in making sure that they are safe. They wouldn't have said that they're free because they didn't think about freedom in the same way that we do, but that they are able to practice their religion, and that they are able to live essentially according to the tenets of Christianity. And that importance trumps literally everything else that we would be thinking about or talking about, or that separates us from them. And this is a durable concept, and it lasts essentially and importantly, after the Reformation as well. So Elizabeth I is still talking about Christendom, and she is delighted in 1571 that the Roman Catholic Holy League has triumphed over the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. She's delighted. So Christendom, yeah, as I say, it's probably the most important sort of concept to get your head around when you're talking about the Crusades.
Right. Maybe one more question before we break. It was a wonderful introduction to the series, Charlotte. I've got horrible visions of thinking about Donald Trump and the reestablishment of Jerusalem as a center of
Honestly.
Christian,
The last thing we need is the 97th Crusade. Yes, sorry, I had some Zoom issues at the beginning. Those will be fixed by next week when I'm at home rather than being at the Southwark Diocesan office.
Looking at a beautiful bit of interior design there, Charlotte.
I know, it's a fabulous sort of drop ceiling, isn't it? It will be great to go home and have all my books around me. But I'm delighted that so many of you have been here, and I hope you come back next week.
Well, we look forward to it, and we hope you get home now and have a good supper.
Thank you very much.
Away from that drop ceiling. All right, good night to everyone, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks very much, Charlotte.
God bless. Bye-bye now. Bye.
You too.
Very good.